The stench hit me first, a thick, cloying perfume of turned earth and something far fouler. It clung to the humid air, a chemical kiss that promised decay and discovery. My boots crunched on loose gravel as I navigated the uneven terrain, a recently cleared patch of forest tucked away behind a disused industrial park. The raw, exposed clay of the excavated pit glowed ochre in the harsh glare of the portable floodlights, creating stark shadows that danced with every slight breeze. "Took I long enough, Cole?" the lead detective grumbled, his voice strained, a hand rubbing the back of his neck. He stood at the edge of the pit, a figure silhouetted against the artificial dawn, his face grim. "We've been here since dusk." I nodded, not bothering with pleasantries. My eyes were already scanning the scene, taking in the scale of it. This wasn't a single burial. This was an excavation site, a crime scene the size of a small swimming pool, disturbed earth everywhere, and within it, the unmistakable geometry of human remains. "How many?" I asked, pulling on my examination gloves, the latex snapping against my wrist. The detective just shook his head, a muscle jumping in his jaw. "More than we want, much more." I descended into the pit, careful with my footing. The ground was slick in places, recently rained on. The air grew heavier, the smell intensifying. A grim welcome. Below, a team of forensic technicians moved with a practiced somber choreography, sifting soil, marking grid lines with orange flags, photographing every exposed bone. They were good, disciplined, but even their usual efficiency seemed tinged with a palpable unease. This was beyond their routine. My gaze settled on the first cluster of bones. A femur here, a pelvis there, ribs scattered like discarded kindling. The soil around them was dark, rich with organic decomposition, but the sheer quantity. I knelt, pulling a small brush from my kit, and began to carefully clear the dirt from a section of exposed cranium. The bone was discolored, stained brown and green from years, perhaps decades, in the earth. The skull was fragmented, but enough remained to tell a story. There were multiple layers here, I realized, the horror of it settling deep in my gut. Not one grave, but a burial ground. A mass grave, yes, but almost stacked. The remains weren't simply thrown in haphazardly. There was an organization to the chaos, a disturbing, deliberate placement that hinted at something more than a panicked disposal. As I worked, brushing away the clinging soil, my mind raced through protocols, through previous cases, trying to categorize, to contextualize. Nothing quite fit. The sheer volume was staggering. I counted at least 6 distinct crania visible from my vantage point alone. And the pit stretched further. Then I saw it. It was on a partial mandible, half buried in the clay, not a fracture from blunt force trauma nor the gnawing of scavengers. This was precise. A clean, almost surgical excision of the alveolar bone, the part that holds the teeth. It wasn't broken, it was removed. The edges were smooth, as if deliberately carved away. My breath hitched. I leaned closer, my magnifiers pressed against my goggles. The technique was too refined for a random act of violence. This suggested skill, a specific tool, and a very particular intent. "Cole," the lead detective's voice cut through my concentration from the edge of the pit. "Anything?" "Hold on," I mumbled, my voice tight. I moved carefully to another set of remains, a fragmented ribcage lying partly exposed. I cleared the dirt, and there it was again. A similar, precise cut, this time on a sternum. Not a break, not a hack. A deliberate, almost artistic removal of a small, rectangular section of bone. It was too consistent, too specific to be accidental. My internal alarm bells began to clang, a dissonant chorus in my head. This wasn't a serial killer with a signature. This was something else. The mutilation wasn't about inflicting pain or expressing rage in a conventional sense. It was about taking. I spent the next several hours in a trance, moving from one set of remains to the next, meticulously documenting every scrap of bone, every fragment of evidence. The sun rose, painting the scene in a brutal, unforgiving light, only to be obscured again by the shifting clouds. The smell never faded. The pattern became undeniable. Across at least 8 of the 15 individuals I could identify in the exposed layers, the same peculiar excisions appeared. Sometimes the mandible, sometimes the sternum, occasionally a specific section of a long bone, the tibia, the radius. Always the same clean, almost ritualistic removal. It wasn't about dismemberment, it was about surgical precision, about taking a very specific piece. "We need to get some of these out of here," I finally said, looking up at the lead detective, who had come down into the pit to observe my work. My voice was hoarse, my throat dry. The preservation isn't perfect, but the markings are clear enough. I need these under a scope, in a controlled environment. Now. He nodded, his face mirroring my grim determination. Which ones? The ones with the specific bone modifications, I replied, pointing to several marked areas. And we need a full environmental sample from each layer. This isn't going to be a quick identification job. This is something different. Later that day, the most crucial remains were carefully extracted, wrapped, and transported. My mind was still back in the pit, replaying the images, the patterns, the unsettling precision of the cuts. The destination was a secure, unassuming building, its exterior bland concrete, its interior sterile and brightly lit. Finally, I arrived at the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. The very phrase sent a shiver down my spine. It implied a swift, critical need for answers, bypassing usual procedures. The examination room was a stark tableau of stainless steel and powerful lights. The air conditioning hummed, a counterpoint to the buzzing in my own ears. I laid out the first skull fragment on a clean sheet, positioning it under the microscope. The others waited, carefully tagged and arranged on adjacent tables, each a silent testament to a life ended by something incomprehensible. I spent hours, lost in the magnified landscape of bone. The excisions were even clearer here, almost too perfect. They weren't saw marks. They weren't knife marks in the conventional sense. They were something else, something I couldn't quite place, yet felt disturbingly familiar, like an echo from a history book I'd only skimmed. A precise, almost delicate removal, as if the bone itself was a valuable commodity, extracted with care rather than violence. This wasn't a lone madman. The consistency across so many individuals, the sheer scale of the grave, the meticulousness of the bone modifications. This wasn't just murder, it was a process. They were collecting them, or, more accurately, collecting from them. I leaned back from the microscope, rubbing my tired eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, casting a sterile glow on the ancient, violated bones. This wasn't a case I could simply solve with a few measurements and a DNA sample. This was something far older, far more entrenched. The destination was a hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. The air in the loading bay was thick with the sterile bite of industrial cleaner, underlaid by something metallic and faintly sweet, a scent I knew too well. It wasn't the usual setup for a complex anthropological examination, but when the call comes in with mass grave and urgent, I work with what I were given. I supervised as the secure containers were wheeled off the transport, each one holding a meticulously wrapped bundle of human remains. The fluorescent lights of the basement hallway hummed, casting harsh shadows that distorted the faces of the transport officers. My gaze, however, was fixed on the gurneys. Each bundle felt impossibly heavy, a silent accusation. Inside the designated examination room, the space was cold, clinical, and far too small for the sheer volume of evidence. Stainless steel tables gleamed under more stark lighting. A forensic technician, a young woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, was already laying out the basic toolkit. Brushes, calipers, measuring tapes, a set of dental probes. He offered a quick, grave nod. "Ready when you are, Cole." "As ready as I'll ever be," I muttered, pulling on a fresh pair of nitrile gloves. The weight of expectation, not just from the law enforcement officials breathing down my neck, but from the voiceless individuals in those containers, settled heavily on my shoulders. We started with the first container, carefully unwrapping the bundle. The remains were fragmented, disarticulated, a jumble of long bones, ribs, and vertebrae. I gently placed it on a clean tray. My fingers, trained to read the silent language of bone, began their work. I started with the most obvious trauma points, the areas that had screamed for attention back in the pit. The first thing that struck me, even before I had cleaned away the last vestiges of earth, was the precision. These weren't haphazard injuries, nor were they the result of blunt force trauma or animal scavenging. I picked up a femur, rotating it slowly under the lamp. There, just above the condyles, was a series of shallow, almost decorative score marks, not deep enough to be fatal, certainly not in isolation. They were uniform, consistent, almost artistic in their placement. My brow furrowed. I picked up a tibia from the same individual, similar marks, on the fibula, on the radius. It was a pattern, clear and deliberate. "Look at this," I called out to the technician holding up the femur. She leaned in, her gaze tracing the faint lines. "Blade work, Undoubtedly, and not just any blade, something thin, sharp, and applied with significant control. These aren't defensive wounds or perimortem injuries from a struggle. These are deliberate alterations, post-mortem, I'd wager, or very close to the moment of death. My internal clock was already ticking. I needed to establish time of death, cause of death, identity, but the superficial scoring while striking wasn't explaining the fundamental demise of these individuals. I moved to the skull. The same meticulous care had been applied here. Around the orbits, along the mandible, even on the delicate bones of the nasal cavity, identical score marks. It was horrifyingly consistent. Any personal effects? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Back in the pit, there had been nothing. Not a single button, a scrap of fabric, a dental filling, a coin, just bone and earth. The technician shook her head, consulting her notes. Nothing, not a trace. No clothing fragments, no jewelry, no dental work that would stand out. Standard issue, if that. Minimal, if any, restorative dentistry across the board. That was a problem, a huge problem. Without any identifiers, I was essentially looking at ghosts. No names, no history, just bone. And the lack of anything mundane felt deliberate. People don't just vanish without a trace of their everyday lives, not a single one of them. I moved to the next set of remains and then the next. The pattern held. Every single individual, regardless of skeletal completeness, bore these same ritualistic score marks. It wasn't just a signature, it was a manifesto. And it wasn't the only thing. As I began to articulate the vertebrae of one individual, I noticed something else. The first few cervical vertebrae were present, but the atlas and axis, the two topmost vertebrae that support the skull and allow its movement, were missing. Not broken, not crushed, but absent. Are they present? The technician, sensing the shift in my tone, moved with renewed urgency. She began sifting through the remains of the second and third individuals. A few minutes later, his voice, usually steady, held a tremor. Cole. They're missing here too. Clean breaks at C3. No signs of fracture on the remaining cervicals, just absence. My mind raced, missing atlas and axis. Ritualistic scoring, no personal effects. It was too much to be coincidence. This wasn't just a mass grave, it was a meticulously curated collection. The removal of the C1 and C2 would have required significant anatomical knowledge and a very specific tool, not just a random act of violence. It would have effectively decapitated the individual, but in a way that left no visible evidence of severing if the head was then removed cleanly. My gut twisted. This wasn't the work of a lone, deranged individual. The consistency, the precision, the sheer number of victims, the deliberate removal of key anatomical parts, it all pointed to something far more organized, something ancient in its methodology. A collective, a group, but why? And what did they do with the missing vertebrae? I stared at the skull in front of me, its empty eye sockets seeming to stare back. The victims couldn't speak, but their bones were screaming. The implications began to settle in my mind, heavy and unsettling. This wasn't just a forensic case. It felt like a door opening onto a history I didn't want to know. The hum of fluorescent lights, too bright and too cold, always seemed to amplify the silence in the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. The air, thick with the scent of disinfectant and something metallic, clung to my clothes. I stood over the first of the four remains, laid out on a stainless steel table, a stark contrast to the muddy earth I'd unearthed them from. My hands, still tingling from the cold of the grave site, were now gloved and ready. "All right, let's see what else you have to tell me," I murmured to the bone, a femur that had lost its fleshy sheath centuries ago. Beside me, the forensic technician, a quiet woman with sharp eyes, meticulously catalogued the bones as I pointed them out. Each piece was a puzzle. The ritualistic scoring on the cervical vertebrae, the precise removal of the C1 and C2, was consistent across the initial three sets of remains I'd examined. Now, with the fourth laid out, I was looking for patterns, for deviations. "The soil analyst is waiting for your word on the samples, Cole," the technician said, his voice soft but clear. "Send her in," I replied, not looking up from the fifth cervical vertebra. The scoring here was identical, a thin, almost surgical line circling the bone, just superior to the body. It wasn't amateur work. This required an understanding of anatomy, an intimate knowledge of where the bone met cartilage, where the soft tissue would give way. A moment later, the soil analyst, a brisk woman with dirt perpetually under her fingernails, entered. She carried a series of small, sealed bags, each containing a sample from a different stratum of the grave. Cole, the initial readings are interesting. I finally looked up, peeling off a glove to rub my temple. Interesting how? Well, the deepest layer, the one directly beneath the remains, shows a high concentration of a specific mineral, a type of silicate, not typically found in the soil composition of the dig site. Not locally, anyway. It's consistent across all 4 areas where the bodies were laid. She tapped a bag. It suggests the ground was disturbed, and then something else was brought in, or perhaps the bodies were moved from another location and this soil came with them. My brow furrowed. So not just buried but placed, and possibly transported. My mind immediately went to the C1 and C2. Why remove them? To destabilize the head, to sever the connection between mind and body. And if they were moved, where from? The plot thickened, as they say. Exactly, she confirmed. We're running more detailed spectroscopy, but the initial read is compelling. It's a foreign element, definitely, and the layers above it, the fill dirt that matches the local composition, but it's been mixed, disturbed, compacted, not a natural process. Thank you, I said, a new layer of complexity settling over me. This wasn't a quick, desperate burial. This was planned. As the soil analyst left, the entomologist arrived, a younger man with an almost manic energy. He carried a handful of Petri dishes. Cole, the larvae tell a story, though not a complete one. Based on the species and their developmental stage, the initial estimate for the post-mortem interval for all 4 sets of remains is remarkably consistent, between 3 to 5 years before discovery. But there's a catch. I braced myself. There was always a catch. Go on. The species present are consistent with an outdoor burial, exposed to the elements for a time, but some of the later stage larvae suggest a rapid transition to a more sheltered, possibly deeper environment. Almost as if the bodies were initially left exposed or in a shallow grave and then moved to the deeper pit we found them in. 3 to 5 years. Not ancient, but not recent. And the double burial scenario, first exposed, then buried deeper. That explained the foreign soil too. They weren't just transported, they were reburied. Before I could process that fully, the lead detective on the case, a burly man named Miller with a perpetually skeptical squint, strode into the basement. He bypassed the technician and the entomologist, coming straight for me. All right, Cole, what's the word? We've got a lot of pressure on this. The mayor's breathing down our necks. We need something concrete, some kind of motive, some kind of lead that doesn't involve, what was it, ancient rituals? His tone was laced with thinly veiled impatience. I pushed my glasses up my nose. Detective, what I have is evidence of meticulous planning, anatomical knowledge, and a consistent pattern of mutilation. The C1 and C2 vertebrae were removed with precision. The soil analysis suggests these individuals were not originally buried where we found them. And the entomology supports a 2-stage burial process. They were exposed, then reinterred. Miller scoffed, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. Reinterred, so some nutjob got his kicks, buried them, then dug them up and buried them again. Come on, Cole, we're looking for a serial killer here, a cult leader, someone we can put a face to. This ancient ritual talk, it's not giving us anything actionable. It's giving you context, detective. This isn't random. This isn't a quick, messy act of passion. This is deliberate. The scoring on the vertebrae, it's not just damage, it's a specific action, and it's the same on all 4 victims. It points to a unique signature. I gestured to the bones, and if they were moved, that means someone spent time with them twice. Someone went to a lot of trouble to conceal the original location, and then the secondary one. Or, Miller countered, crossing his arms. It's one of those sickos who likes to play with his victims, keeps them, moves them around, buries them when he's done. We've seen it before. A lone wolf. A disturbed individual with a flair for the dramatic. He leaned closer. You're an anthropologist, Cole. You look at bones, I look at people, and people do crazy things. His words, blunt and dismissive, pricked at me. There was I overthinking it. There was I seeing patterns where a simpler, more mundane explanation sufficed. A training pushed me to look for the complex, the cultural, the historical. His pushed him for the immediate, the arrestable. Detective, I said, my voice firmer than I felt. The precision here, the consistency across 4 separate individuals. It speaks of something beyond mere play. It speaks of a methodology, a purpose. And the foreign soil, the specific silicate, that's not just some nutjob's backyard dirt. It's specific enough that we might be able to trace its origin. That's a lead, he grunted, unconvinced. Fine, you chase your dirt. I'll chase my living leads. Just give me something solid, Cole. I ran a gloved finger over the C3 of the newest arrival. The score mark was faint but unmistakable. Miller wanted a simple answer, a single deranged mind, and that I knew was far more terrifying than any lone wolf. The detective's heavy boots echoed away, leaving me in the stark silence of the concrete slab room. He wanted solid leads, something tangible for his living suspects. I had nothing but dirt and bones, whispers from the long dead that sounded, even to my own ears, like ancient fables. But I knew better. I just had to decipher the tune. My internal clock, usually a reliable guide, felt skewed. The daylight outside was a distant memory. The call had come in the dead of night, pulling me from a fitful sleep. Emergency autopsy requested. The voice on the line had barked, barely waiting for my affirmation before giving the address. So here I was, deep within the designated hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. It wasn't a place for the sick, not in the way most people understood it. This was a realm of sterile steel, humming air purifiers, and the scent of disinfectant battling the faint, metallic tang of what lay beneath the white sheets. The air was cool, almost clinical, but a prickle of unease still raised the hairs on my arms. This wasn't my usual lab, which felt like a second home. This was an outsourced, temporary setup, hastily arranged, and it carried the weight of urgency. A new set of remains lay waiting for me on a stainless steel table, a stark contrast to the rough earth of the mass grave. This was one of the individuals from the initial recovery, now cleaned and prepped for a closer look. The body bag had been unzipped, revealing what the preliminary field assessment had hinted at. The ritualistic mutilation was present here too. The missing teeth, the specific bone fragments, the precise disarticulation of certain joints. It was all there, a horrifying signature. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping crisply, a small sound in the vast quiet. My tools were laid out with practiced precision: scalpels, probes, forceps, osteological calipers. I leaned over the remains, my magnifying visor clicking into place. The first pass was always visual, a slow, methodical scan searching for anything anomalous. My gaze drifted over the femur, the largest and strongest bone in the body, a testament to endurance. It was clean, almost bleached, courtesy of the processing team, but as I traced a finger along the midshaft, near the distal end, I felt something, a faint irregularity. I brought the visor closer, adjusting the focal length. There, barely visible to the naked eye, were a series of minute, parallel striations. They weren't deep, not like a hacking wound. They were more like fine etchings, almost delicate, too numerous, too precise to be accidental. I ran my gloved fingertip over them again. The sensation was like tracing the grooves of an ancient, petrified record. My brow furrowed. I'd seen thousands of bones, millions of marks. These weren't typical knife marks. A modern blade, even a serrated one, would leave a different pattern, a wider or more erratic groove. These striations were impossibly thin, uniformly spaced, and remarkably consistent in depth. It was as if they'd been made by a tool with multiple, razor-sharp edges, or perhaps a single, extremely fine, serrated edge made of a material I couldn't immediately place. A memory flickered, a dusty image from a long-ago archaeological dig in the Balkans. A ritualistic burial site, centuries old. We'd found similar marks on animal bones, associated with offerings, but human, and so recently. No, that couldn't be right. My mind rebelled against the connection, trying to rationalize it away. A new type of weapon, a specialized tool for something mundane. I grabbed a high-resolution camera, snapping several close-ups, then moved to a stereo microscope. Under its magnification, the marks resolved into breathtaking detail. They were indeed parallel, almost perfectly so, each groove a tiny inverted valley. My breath hitched. This wasn't a lone incident. The detective had dismissed my talk of patterns, but he hadn't seen this. I remembered the femur from the first victim I'd examined at the grave site, the one with the unusual green discoloration. Had I missed these marks then? The lighting had been poor, the bones encrusted with soil. It was entirely possible. A prickle of self-doubt ran through me. Had I been too focused on the obvious mutilations, the missing pieces, to see the subtle, almost invisible details? My gaze darted to the adjacent table, where another set of remains, also from the mass grave, lay covered. I moved quickly, pulling back the sheet. This was a partial skeleton, less complete than the one I was working on. I located a femur, running my fingers over its surface. Nothing. Then I shifted my attention to a tibia, near the articulation with the ankle. There it was, faint but unmistakable. The same series of impossibly fine parallel striations, not as pronounced, perhaps due to post-mortem changes or less forceful application, but definitively the same pattern. This wasn't random. This wasn't the work of a single deranged individual using a common hunting knife or a kitchen implement. This was something else entirely. Cole, a quiet voice broke the stillness. It was the junior assistant, a young woman named Maya, who often helped me with documentation. She stood at the entrance to the lab, clutching a clipboard. "Everything all right? I look like I've seen a ghost." I slowly straightened, peeling off my gloves. "Maya, I need to do something for me. I need every long bone from every victim recovered so far, cleaned and brought to me. Specifically, I need to examine the articulation points, the mid-shafts, any flat cortical surfaces." My voice was steady, but the urgency thrummed beneath the surface. She looked at me, her brow furrowed with concern, then nodded, sensing the shift in my demeanor. "Of course, right away." As she turned to leave, I picked up the phone. I needed to call the lead excavator, see if they'd found anything similar on any of the other recovered remains. And then I needed to call the detective. He wouldn't like what I had to say. This wasn't a serial killer case anymore. It was something far older, far more organized, and infinitely more unsettling. The pattern, the method, the precision of these anachronistic marks. This wasn't just a murderer, this was a tradition. And I had a terrifying feeling that I had just scratched the surface of something vast and ancient, something that had been hiding in plain sight for a very long time. And I was standing right at the edge. The phone felt cold in my hand, a stark contrast to the buzzing in my head. I just wrapped up with the senior excavator, and her voice had been a tight wire of professional concern. She confirmed it, or at least confirmed enough to send a shiver down my spine. A few of the other recovered remains, those still undergoing initial processing before coming to my lab, had shown similar, though less pronounced, anomalies. Not the full, precise signature I'd found, but hints, echoes, enough to tell me I wasn't imagining things. Next, the detective. His voice, when he finally picked up, was a low growl of exhaustion. "Cole, what's so urgent it can't wait until morning?" "It's about the site, detective," I said, trying to keep my own voice even. "The pattern I found, it's not what we thought." A beat of silence. Meaning, I don't think we're looking for a modern individual. This isn't a serial killer with a unique MO. This feels older, much older. I heard a sigh, heavy and put upon. "I need to dig into some historical records, some anthropological archives. I think we're dealing with something ritualistic, something with roots." "Ritualistic? Cole, are you telling me we have a cult, a sacrificial cult operating out of the woods?" There was a note of disbelief, bordering on ridicule in his tone. "I've got a dozen missing persons, a frantic mayor, and a media frenzy brewing. I need leads I can follow, not ancient folklore." "I understand, detective, but if I'm right, ignoring this won't help. The precision, the specific nature of the mutilation, it speaks to a practiced hand, yes, but also a practiced belief. And the excavator just told me there are preliminary indications of similar patterns on other remains from the site. This isn't isolated." "Fine," he grumbled, clearly unconvinced. "Do my thing. But don't come back to me with ghost stories. I need facts, Cole, concrete, actionable facts." "I'll give I facts, detective, just give me some time." I hung up, the weight of his skepticism pressing down on me. He wanted facts, I needed to find them. The usual databases, the modern forensic texts, they were useless for this. I needed to go back, far back. My office became a bunker. I pulled every dusty tome, every obscure journal, every digitized archive I could access. The fluorescent hum of the overhead lights blurred into the hum of my own thoughts, a relentless drone. Days bled into nights. Coffee became a constant companion, its bitter taste a counterpoint to the dry, papery smell of old texts. My fingers flew across the keyboard, searching keywords. Pre-colonial burial practices, ritualistic sacrifice, bone modification, ancient mutilation patterns, forgotten cults, archaic symbols. The initial searches were a swamp of irrelevant data. Viking rituals, Egyptian mummification, tribal scarification, fascinating, but not this. Not the precise, unique signature I'd found on the victims. My frustration mounted, a knot tightening in my stomach. They was the detective right? There was I seeing patterns where none existed, desperate to elevate a gruesome act into something grander, more historical. Then, tucked away in a digitized volume from a forgotten anthropological society, a single, faded illustration caught my eye. It was crude, a woodcut depicting a scene from what appeared to be an archaic initiation rite. And there it was. Not identical, not a perfect match, but undeniably similar. The placement of the wounds, the specific bones affected, the peculiar, almost surgical removal of a small, specific fragment. The accompanying text, translated from a dead language, spoke of the cleansing of the spirit through the severing of the temporal link. It referenced a group, long thought extinct, a clandestine brotherhood that believed in a literal tether between the physical body and the spiritual realm, a tether they sought to sever to achieve something. The text was vague on the something, but terrifyingly precise on the how. My breath hitched. This was it, the link, the historical precedent, the weight. That doesn't add up moment slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. The description was centuries old, from a region thousands of miles away from our current excavation site, yet the ritualistic signature was so eerily similar. How could such a precise, obscure practice reappear here now? This wasn't just a coincidence. This was a legacy. My phone rang, a jarring intrusion into the quiet hum of my research. It was the detective again. Cole. I still chasing ghosts. His tone was tight, sharper than before, because we just got a confirmed identification, a missing person from the city's outskirts, and her remains, well, it's not pretty, some kind of disfigurement. The responding officer said it looked like someone had been practicing some kind of ritual. I'm on my way, I said, grabbing my bag, the old book still open on my desk, its faded illustrations staring back at me. The detective met me at the entrance to the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. The air down there was thick, a metallic tang mingling with the sterile scent of cleaning agents. The lighting was harsh, unforgiving. 2 uniformed officers stood guard outside the examination room, their faces grim. Inside, the medical examiner, a no-nonsense individual with perpetually tired eyes, was already at work, her tools laid out with surgical precision. The victim was young, or had been. The medical examiner had already begun her external examination, and my eyes immediately went to the telltale marks. It was there. The pattern, the unique ritualistic mutilation, fresh and stark on these new remains, the same precise removal of the bone fragment, the same telltale incisions. It was identical to what I'd found on the ancient remains, perfectly replicated. Just came in, the medical examiner muttered, not looking up from her work. Found by a hiker. Looks like she hasn't been gone long, a few days, maybe a week. I leaned closer, my gaze fixed on the meticulous, horrifying work. It wasn't just similar, it was a perfect echo. This wasn't some random imitation. This was a direct, unbroken lineage of a practice, of training. This wasn't an amateur or a one-off. This is practiced, this is taught. The detective, who had been observing over my shoulder, let out a low whistle. So, your ancient cult. They're still around. I looked at him, then back at the body on the table. The implications were enormous. This wasn't just a historical curiosity, and they were still here, still performing their cleansing of the spirit. My initial thought that this was something far, felt like a massive understatement. This was something terrifyingly persistent, deeply ingrained, and utterly ruthless. The cold clarity I'd felt moments ago, the realization that the danger was terrifyingly real, had solidified into a leaden weight in my stomach. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a certainty, heavy and unyielding. The dead, I knew, were no longer just a puzzle for me to solve. They were a direct threat, a chilling message whispered from the past into a very perilous present. My phone rang, a jarring sound in the quiet reflection of my office. It was the detective, his voice tight. Cole, we have a problem. Another one, fresh. No need to ask where. There was only one place for an urgent examination of this magnitude. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow on the polished stainless steel and white-tiled floors. The medical examiner, a seasoned professional with a perpetually weary look, glanced up as I entered the room. His eyes, usually sharp with professional curiosity, held a new kind of grimness. Cole, he acknowledged, nodding towards the table. There it was. A body, still unnervingly fresh, draped under a sheet. The sheet was pulled back from the head and torso. This wasn't one of the ancient victims from the mass grave, not a bone for me to meticulously piece together. This was a man, or what was left of him, probably in his late 30s, his skin still retaining a semblance of life, though his eyes were wide and vacant. But it was the precise, almost artistic horror of his wounds that drew my gaze, that made my breath catch. The medical examiner didn't need to say a word. I saw it immediately, a sickening echo of the patterns I'd unearthed from the earth-stained bones. The same specific excisions, the precise removal of certain tissues, the deliberate, almost surgical mutilations around the chest and neck. It was identical in form to the ritual I'd pieced together from the ancient remains. The execution, however, was starkly different. "The tool marks," I murmured, leaning closer, my eyes tracing the clean edges of the wounds, the deliberate angles. "These aren't the crude instruments suggested by the earlier findings. This is modern, professional." The medical examiner grunted, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "Scalpel precise, I'd say, or something very similar, and the speed. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it fast. No hesitation." My mind raced, connecting the dots. This wasn't just a copycat. This was the same organization, evolved, adapted, and now they weren't just burying their victims in hidden graves, they were leaving them to be found, a message. "It's the same pattern though," I stated, my voice quiet but firm. "The exact same sequence of removals, the specific points of incision. It's too precise to be coincidence. This isn't just a brutal murder, it's a continuation of the ritual." The detective, who had been observing from a corner, stepped forward, his expression grim. "I res saying what I think I res saying, Cole. I'm saying this is a direct link," I affirmed, gesturing to the body. "This confirms everything I suspected about the mass grave. This isn't ancient history. This is now, and it's organized. This level of detail, this exact replication across centuries, it speaks of a tradition, a system passed down. And the slight deviation in the tool marks the modernity of the execution. It tells me they've updated their methods, but not their purpose." "Wait, that doesn't add up," the medical examiner interjected, frowning. "If it's the same group, why leave this one out in the open? Why the emergency call to us, to anyone who gets too close?" Just as the words left my mouth, the door to the autopsy suite swung open. A tall, impeccably dressed man, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, stepped in. He wasn't law enforcement, nor was he medical staff. He was simply the official, a figure of quiet authority I'd seen drift through various high-profile cases, always observing, rarely speaking. He radiated an aura of immense, unspoken power. His gaze swept over the room, settling on me for a fraction longer than anyone else. "Professor Cole," he replied, his voice smooth, almost melodic, yet entirely devoid of warmth. "I understand I've formed some rather provocative theories regarding our recent discoveries. My findings are based on empirical evidence," I responded, meeting his gaze directly, though I felt a prickle of unease. "The patterns are undeniable. Indeed, patterns can be interpreted in many ways," he continued, taking a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving mine. "And interpretations can have far-reaching consequences, Professor, for the public, for the stability of certain institutions, complicated by an overzealous pursuit of an improbable narrative, especially one that might stir up unnecessary alarm. Some truths are best left undisturbed, wouldn't I agree, for the greater good?" My jaw tightened. This wasn't a suggestion, it was a thinly veiled threat. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing in on me. The medical examiner looked away, suddenly finding an intense interest in a nearby surgical tray. The detective shifted uncomfortably. "My job is to give voice to the dead, sir," I stated, my own voice firmer than I felt. "To uncover the truth, whatever it may be." The official offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "A noble pursuit. Just ensure that truth doesn't become a convenient narrative for those who might wish to exploit it, or for those who might find themselves out of their depth." He held my gaze for another long moment, his eyes like chips of ice, before turning and exiting as quietly as he had arrived. Had I overstepped? Was I seeing connections where none truly existed, simply because I wanted to believe in a grander, more terrifying conspiracy? My mind replayed the official's words, his tone, the way he'd emphasized improbable narrative and out of their depth. But then I looked back at the body on the table, at the precise, horrifying wounds. And I remembered the bones, the identical marks, the ancient rituals. No, this wasn't improbable. This was horrifyingly real, And the official's visit wasn't a warning about my career, it was a warning about me. My presence, my findings were now inconvenient. The danger, already palpable, had just become intensely, terrifyingly personal. The official's words had clung to me like a shroud, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips as he spoke of inconvenient truths and depths out of which I might find myself. I'd walked away from that exchange with a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air, a prickle of unease that burrowed deep. It was a warning, plain as day, cloaked in civility. I just hadn't expected the immediate aftermath to feel quite so institutional. My phone rang before I'd even reached my car. A brisk, clipped voice on the other end, identifying himself only as a departmental liaison, informed me that an emergency autopsy had been requested. Not at the secure forensics lab I usually worked from, but at a facility I rarely visited. "They're moving fast on this, Cole," the liaison had said, his tone devoid of warmth. "One of the more intact victims from the recent discovery. High priority. They want I down there immediately." The hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested facility. The designation hit me like a misplaced hammer. A hospital basement. It wasn't unheard of for overflow or for specific types of examination, but it felt off. My usual facilities were purpose-built, separate. This felt like being shunted into a forgotten corner. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested facility was exactly as sterile and unwelcoming as the name suggested. It was a maze of gray corridors, white-tiled walls, and the omnipresent hum of ventilation systems. The air was cool, carrying a faint, metallic tang I couldn't quite place. No bright, comforting signs, no bustling staff in scrubs, just locked doors and muted lights. I had to show my credentials 3 times before a security officer, a stocky individual with eyes that gave nothing away, finally waved me through to the specific bay. Inside, the room was brightly lit, a stainless steel table dominating the center. On it, draped in a thin sheet, lay the remains. This wasn't bone yet, not entirely. It was a recently recovered body, preserved enough to still hold the gruesome details of its end. The sheet was pulled back just as I entered, revealing the upper torso. And there it was, stark and unmistakable, the unique, ritualistic mutilation I had documented on the older skeletal remains. A specific pattern of cuts, precise and deliberate, etched into the flesh and bone around the clavicle and sternum. It was a signature. A uniformed detective, not the lead investigator I typically worked with, stood by the table, arms crossed, observing me with an unnervingly steady gaze. "Finally, the expert has arrived," he drawled, his voice flat. "We've been waiting. The preliminary report suggests animal activity, scavengers post-mortem, consistent with exposure in the elements." I blinked. Animal activity. My eyes swept over the intricate cuts, the almost surgical precision of the removal of specific bone fragments. This wasn't a badger or a fox. This was human. "Detective," I began, my voice carefully neutral, "with all due respect, these marks are far too clean, too specific. The pattern can be a coincidence, Cole," he interrupted, pushing a stack of papers towards me. "Or overinterpretation. Look, we've got a lot on our plates. This mass grave thing, it's a mess. A very old mess. We need clear answers, not theories about ancient rituals." Theories? I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. These aren't theories. These are observable facts. The same pattern on a dozen different bodies across decades, now on a relatively fresh recovery. It's a signature, detective. It speaks to intent, to a specific practice. He merely shrugged, glancing at a technician across the room who was meticulously bagging tools. "Intent or not, we're looking for something concrete. Something that ties this to a living perpetrator, not some dusty cult. We're trying to close this case, not open a whole new can of worms." His dismissive tone, the way he brushed off the most crucial piece of evidence, made my blood run cold. It wasn't just resistance. It felt like a deliberate attempt to redirect, to obscure. Was this the inconvenient truth the official had warned me about? I moved closer to the table, ignoring the detective. The body was that of a young adult, gender indeterminate at a glance. The skin was discolored, but the wounds were clear. I pulled on my gloves, reaching for a magnifying glass. The detective cleared his throat. "We're not looking for more fantastical stories, Cole. We're looking for something we can take to a prosecutor, something simple." Simple. My voice was sharper than I intended. "There's nothing simple about this." I leaned in, examining the edges of the cuts. The precision was breathtaking, almost artistic in its brutality. I remembered the faint, almost imperceptible striations I'd noted on the older bones, indicative of a specific type of blade. Here, on the fresher tissue, those marks were even clearer. Then my gaze caught something. Tucked almost invisibly into a small fold of tissue near one of the excised bone fragments, something glinted. I carefully nudged it with a gloved finger, then used a pair of fine tweezers to extract it. It wasn't bone, it wasn't organic, but it wasn't obsidian. As I held it up to the light, I saw faint, almost microscopic markings on its surface. Not tool marks, but something else. Etchings. What's that? The detective asked, finally showing a flicker of interest. I don't know, I admitted, my heart thrumming with a sudden, electrifying realization. But it's not from animal activity. I looked closer, turning the fragment this way and that. The etchings, they were geometric. A series of interconnected lines, forming a symbol I vaguely recognized from some obscure archaeological text. A symbol associated with ancient groups, not always benevolent ones. It was a pattern, just like the mutilation. But this was a pattern within the mutilation itself. This wasn't just a signature, it was a calling card. And it was lodged within the wound, meaning it was left there deliberately or as a consequence of the ritual itself. Not scavengers, not coincidence. We need to get this to the lab, I stated, my voice firm. Immediately, and I need full, unrestricted access to the body for a complete forensic examination. Every square inch. The detective's eyes narrowed, expression hardening. He looked from the tiny fragment in my tweezers to the body on the table, then back to me. That won't be possible, Cole, he answered, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. The official request was for a preliminary assessment, nothing more. This body is being transferred out of my jurisdiction. My breath hitched. Transferred, just as I found something concrete, something undeniable. Transferred where? That's not my concern, he replied, stepping between me and the table, effectively blocking my access. His stance was subtly aggressive, a clear message. My preliminary assessment is complete. The report will reflect animal activity as per our findings. I can include this wasn't just obstruction, it was a full-blown cover-up. They wanted this gone. They wanted me gone. The official's words echoed in my ears. Ensure that truth doesn't become a convenient narrative for those who might wish to exploit it. And that meant the organization I was hunting was far more entrenched, far more powerful than I had dared to imagine. My depth, it seemed, was about to be tested, and I was just beginning to realize how far I was willing to sink to find the truth. The flickering fluorescent lights of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hummed a tune of sterile dread. I'd spent enough time in these kinds of places to be immune to their usual chill, but tonight, a different kind of cold seeped into my bones. It wasn't the temperature of the room, it was the weight of what I was up against, the realization that every official channel had become a potential choke point. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the latex snapping crisply against my wrists. A new arrival, this one, not from the original mass grave, but a recent discovery. A transient, the initial report claimed, found in a derelict warehouse on the edge of the city. But the mutilations, even from the preliminary glance, screamed familiar. The same precise excisions, the same ritualistic pattern I'd been chasing through the dust and decay of the mass grave. Initial assessment points to blunt force trauma to the cranium as the primary cause. The assistant murmured, gesturing to the body on the stainless steel table. The other, alterations, appear post-mortem. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the victim's face, or what was left of it. I moved closer, my breath shallow behind the mask. The skin was pallid, almost translucent, stretched taut over prominent cheekbones. This individual had been thin, likely malnourished, even before the end. My fingers, gloved, traced the contours of the jaw. The bone felt fragile beneath the thin layer of tissue. I examined the neck, the shoulders, looking for anything that deviated from the established pattern. The other victims had been carefully prepared, almost artfully presented. This one felt, cruder, hasty, as if the ritual had been rushed or perhaps interrupted. That detail, however small, snagged at my attention. The organization was meticulous, almost obsessive in its methods. A deviation suggested something new, something different. I picked up a magnifying glass, its heavy frame cool in my hand, and began a systematic scan of the torso. The chest cavity was open, revealing a landscape of meticulously dissected organs. The assistant had done a thorough job, but I wasn't looking for the obvious. I was looking for the overlooked, the incidental, the clue that wasn't meant to be part of the grand design. Minutes bled into an hour. The only sounds were the whirring of the ventilation system, the occasional clink of a tool, and the rhythmic thrum of my own pulse. I went over every inch of the body, from the top of the head to the tips of the toes. I examined the fingernails, checking for skin or fibers. Nothing. I scraped beneath the toenails, finding only grime consistent with the derelict warehouse. Frustration began to prickle at the edges of my focus. There was I chasing ghosts. There was the exhaustion finally catching up, making me imagine patterns where none existed. The official narrative, pushed by certain elements within the investigation, suggested a lone, disturbed individual, a sick mind mimicking a pattern. But I knew better. The scale, the precision, the sheer number of victims, it spoke of something far more organized. I sighed, a puff of warm air fogging my mask for a moment. My eyes drifted back to the cranium, the site of the fatal blow. The assistant had already noted the fracture lines, the impact point. But as I leaned in, my magnifying glass pressed against the scalp, something glinted. Not on the scalp itself, but just beneath the hairline, where the skin met the bone. It was tiny, no bigger than a grain of sand. A sliver of something metallic, embedded deep in the bone, almost imperceptible. It wasn't bone fragment. It wasn't a piece of the weapon. It was different. My heart gave a little jolt. This was it, the overlooked. Scalpel, I murmured, my voice raspy. The assistant handed me the instrument without a word, anticipating my need. With delicate precision, I worked around the sliver, careful not to damage it further. It was deeply lodged, requiring steady hands and absolute focus. Finally, with a soft pop, it came free. I placed it on a sterile slide and moved to the powerful microscope in the corner. Adjusting the focus, I leaned in. The image that resolved itself on the eyepiece made my breath catch in my throat. It wasn't just a random piece of metal. It was a fragment, barely a millimeter long, but distinct. It had microscopic serrations, too fine to be seen with the naked eye. And more importantly, it was etched with an almost imperceptible symbol, 3 interlocking triangles. A symbol I had seen before, not on the victims, but in an old, obscure text I'd found in my university's restricted archives, detailing ancient cults and secret societies. This wasn't a tool mark from a serial killer. This was a fragment from a specialized instrument, one that bore the insignia of a group that had been dismissed as myth for centuries. The blunt force trauma wasn't from a random attack. It was from a specific tool, one used perhaps to subdue or to deliver a quick, efficient end before the ritual began. And that tool, I now realized, was likely manufactured or commissioned by the very organization I suspected. Wait a minute, I muttered, my mind racing. The initial reports on the mass grave victims had noted clean skull fractures, almost surgical. But this one had a rougher edge, as if the implement had slipped or been wielded with less care. The fragment itself was crude, not the polished steel one would expect from a ritualistic instrument. That didn't add up. The organization was about precision, about perfection. Why the deviation here? Unless this victim wasn't meant to be found, or wasn't meant to be part of the larger, public display. This was a discard, a mistake, a body disposed of hastily. My gaze snapped back to the overall condition of the body. The rushed ritual, the hasty disposal, the unique tool fragment. This wasn't just another victim. This was a break in their carefully constructed facade. This was proof that the organization existed, that it was active, and that it had made a mistake. The tension in the room thickened, no longer just from the grim task, but from the realization of what this meant. I had something tangible, something undeniably specific. But it also meant I was closer to them than ever before, and they were closer to me, and I was just beginning to realize how far they would go to protect their secrets. This individual, lying cold and stark on the stainless steel table in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was undeniably one of them. The eyes, as always, were gone, replaced by a void. I moved closer, my breath shallow behind the mask, the sterile tang of disinfectant doing little to mask the coppery scent in the air. "Anything new, Cole?" the detective asked, his voice a low rumble from behind me. I could feel his impatience, a palpable weight in the cramped space. He'd been pushing for answers, for a name, for anything concrete since the mass grave discovery, and now this fresh horror. Still processing, I murmured, my gaze fixed on the victim's left inner thigh. It was subtle, almost imperceptible against the mottled skin, but I saw it. A series of faint, raised lines like an ancient brand, not a tattoo, not ink, scarification, deliberate, precise. I leaned in closer, adjusting the overhead lamp. The pattern was a stylized knot, intricate and angular, unlike anything I'd seen in modern criminal circles. It felt older, primal. I remembered a similar symbol, not identical, but the style, the intent, a week ago. During the painstaking excavation of the third mass grave site, a colleague had found a shard of pottery. It was small, no bigger than my thumb, but preserved enough to show a fragment of an etched design. We'd catalogued it, photographed it, and then, in the rush to identify the victims and their cause of death, it had been relegated to a box of minor artifacts. An interesting curiosity, but nothing that screamed clue. Until now, I've seen something like this before. I responded more to myself than to the detective. My mind raced, pulling at threads of memory, the pottery shard, and before that, during my research into the local historical society's archives, a faded sketch in an old journal attributed to a colonial-era cartographer depicting a boundary marker. It had the same angular knotwork. At the time, I dismissed it as a regional emblem, perhaps a forgotten clan crest, just another piece of local flavor. Where? The detective asked, his tone sharpening. A historical text, I added, pushing myself upright, a sudden jolt of adrenaline making my hands tremble slightly, and a fragment of pottery from the third site. I thought it was just decorative, a regional motif. I paused, running a hand over my masked face. But it's more than that. This isn't just a design, it's a signature, a lineage signature. The detective looked at me, a flicker of doubt in his eyes. A lineage. Cole, we're talking about a serial killer, or a group of them, not some royal family. That's where we've been wrong, I countered, my voice gaining conviction. It's both. This mark. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken questions. The Ethelrids. The name was almost mythical in this region. One of the founding families, whose ancestral estate was still perched on the highest hill overlooking the valley, even though their direct influence had supposedly waned centuries ago. They were seen as eccentric, reclusive, clinging to old money and older traditions, but killers. It sounded like something out of a pulp novel. The Ethelrids, the detective finally managed, his voice laced with disbelief. They're practically ghosts. No one's seen the current head of the family, old Elias Ethelred, in years. They keep to themselves. Exactly, I answered, pacing the small perimeter of the room. Too much to themselves. This symbol, this knot. It's been linked to their ancestral crest for generations. Not prominently, not in public records, but in obscure historical documents, in their personal archives. I remember seeing it in a display at the Historical Society, a small, tarnished silver ring, engraved with this exact knot, attributed to the first Ethelred settler. My thoughts were a whirlwind now, connecting disparate pieces of information. The ritualistic mutilations, the ancient origins of the symbol, the reclusive family, it was all starting to coalesce into a terrifying picture. The old Ethelred texts, the ones nobody takes seriously anymore, I continued, my voice picking up speed. They talk about the sacred duty, the purification of the land, the eyes of true vision. We dismissed it as archaic religious ramblings, the ramblings of a dying aristocratic line. But what if it wasn't? What if it was a doctrine? I pointed back to the victim, the missing eyes. It's not just mutilation, it's symbolic. The texts mention sacrificing earthly sight to perceive the divine path. These victims aren't just being killed, they're being offered to fulfill some ancient, twisted prophecy or to maintain a perceived purity of their lineage or their land. You're saying the Ethelrids are behind this? The detective asked, his brow furrowed, the disbelief warring with a sudden horror. That they've been systematically abducting and killing people for generations, all based on some archaic family creed? It fits. I responded, though even to my own ears it sounded insane. The mass graves, the ritual, the precise, almost surgical removal of the eyes. This isn't random violence. It's ritualized, organized, and deeply rooted. And this scarification mark on this latest victim, it's their seal, their claim, a sign of their twisted sacred duty. My gaze swept over the pale, unseeing face of the victim. Purity, control. The texts speak of maintaining their divine right to the land, of cleansing it of undesirables. They believe they are the chosen stewards, and these rituals, these sacrifices, are their way of fulfilling that sacred duty. We weren't just hunting a killer, we were facing an entire institution, a secret society hidden in plain sight, with roots deeper than anyone could have imagined. And now, I had given them a name. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick, metallic, and cold. It clung to my lungs, a tangible weight that matched the dread in my gut. This wasn't the usual quiet, sterile environment I was accustomed to. This place felt provisional, hastily prepared, with exposed pipes snaking across the low ceiling and the hum of unseen machinery vibrating through the concrete floor. The sense of urgency was palpable, a stark contrast to the methodical pace I usually preferred for my work. Another victim, fresh, not centuries old, not even decades. This was now, this was current. I stood over the subject, a young man, perhaps in his late 20s, his skin still retaining a semblance of life that the bones from the mass grave had long surrendered. The familiar, ritualistic mutilation was undeniable. It was the signature, unmistakable, and utterly terrifying in its recency. Anything. Cole, a colleague asked, his voice muffled by his mask, the question a low rumble in the quiet space. I didn't answer immediately. My gloved fingers traced the edge of clean cut on the femur, a cut I knew intimately from the other victims. But this time, something else caught my eye. Embedded in the surrounding tissue, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a tiny, glinting shard. Not bone, not metal from a weapon. I carefully extracted it with tweezers, placing it on a sterile Petri dish. Under the microscope, the shard resolved into a fragment of obsidian, exquisitely carved. On its surface, barely discernible without magnification, was a symbol. A coiled serpent, its head forming a stylized M, its tail looping into an H. The symbol of the organization. The one I had painstakingly pieced together from fragmented carvings on bone and faded parchment. The one whose name I had whispered into the silence of my lab only days ago. This wasn't just a historical pattern re-emerging, it was an ongoing operation. The organization wasn't a ghost. It was a living, breathing entity operating right here, right now. This young man was there present. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from a surge of righteous fury. This is fresh. I pointed to the obsidian shard, still under the microscope. This isn't a relic. This is a contemporary piece used in the ritual. The colleague peered into the eyepiece, his breath catching. Good God, Cole, are I certain? Absolutely, I affirmed, my gaze hardening. And this changes everything. We can't just trace history anymore. We have to stop them from making more of it. Later that evening, the city lights blurred outside the window of the detective's cramped office. He sat opposite me, nursing a lukewarm coffee, his face etched with a familiar weariness. Doing this, now. Exactly, I confirmed, pushing the Petri dish with the shard across his desk. And they're not just some fringe cult. The name I found, it connects to institutions, to families with power and influence that span generations. They're hidden in plain sight. He picked up the dish, turning the tiny obsidian fragment over with a pen. This is damning, Cole, but proof. We need more than a fragment and a theory. No matter how solid, we need something concrete that ties them to this current victim, to the mass grave, in a way that stands up in court. Something that exposes their entire network. I know, I added, leaning forward, which is why I've been thinking, the documents, the records I found hints of in my research, they must be somewhere. A central archive, a hidden vault. If we could get inside, if we could find their current membership lists, their operational plans, their financial records. The detective's eyes narrowed. Infiltrate? Cole, this isn't some dusty library. If what you say is true, these people are dangerous. Extremely dangerous. They've been operating in secret for centuries. They wouldn't hesitate. A knot tightened in my stomach. He was right. The sheer scale of their influence, the ruthlessness evident in their victims, it was terrifying. I was a scientist, not a commando. But the faces of the dead, the silent suffering etched into their bones, propelled me forward. I had to give them a voice. I understand the risk, I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. But what other choice do we have? They're still out there. Another victim came in today. How many more will there be before we act? He sighed, running a hand over his face. All right, where would these records be? You mentioned a historical society, a front. The Society for Ancient Rites and Cultural Preservation. I explained, pulling out a crumpled printout from my bag. It's listed as a non-profit, but its address, its board members, they all connect back to the names I've found. It has a private, members-only archive, heavily restricted. I suspect that's where they keep their true history and their current dealings. A private archive, he mused. That complicates things. No warrant would ever get us in without concrete proof, and that's what we're trying to get. He looked at me, a grim resolve hardening his features. So we go in, we get the proof, but we do it smart. No heroics, Cole. We both knew the answer. If we got caught, we would likely become another forgotten statistic, another set of bones for some future forensic anthropologist to puzzle over. The plan began to form, a dangerous, fragile thing. We would need a diversion, a way to bypass their security, and a means to quickly identify the crucial documents. My expertise in deciphering ancient scripts and patterns would be vital. The detective would handle the physical entry and extraction. Walking back to my own apartment, the city felt different. I was no longer an observer of history. I was now an active participant in a very dangerous present. What if I'm wrong? What if this is all a delusion? A misinterpretation? But then the image of the young man in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, flashed in my mind, the obsidian shard glinting, and the doubt solidified into an iron resolve. This was no delusion. This was real, and I was going to unearth their secrets no matter the cost. I just hoped I wouldn't become one of their secrets myself. My hands, still faintly smelling of disinfectant and the metallic tang of fresh death, trembled with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Tomorrow we would move. The plan was a single fragile thread stretched taut across a chasm of uncertainty. One wrong step, and we'd both plummet. I rest sure about the timing, I whispered, adjusting the small, high-definition camera taped beneath the lapel of my borrowed lab coat. It felt heavy, a brick in my chest pocket, not just with its weight, but with the enormity of what it needed to capture. Positive. The colleague replied, his voice a low rumble beside me. He checked his watch, the digital glow briefly illuminating the grim set of his jaw. Their contact confirmed the delivery. The emergency autopsy request is logged for precisely 0200 hours. They think it's a cover, a way to move evidence discreetly, but it's our cover. The irony was a bitter taste. An emergency autopsy, requested by the very people we were trying to expose. To cover their tracks was now our only way in. Our destination, a specific section of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. Not the main facility, but a sub-level, rarely used, accessible by a service elevator that smelled faintly of stale disinfectant and something else, something metallic and cloying like old blood. Remember, I answered, my voice barely audible. Get the signal out the moment I'm in, no matter what. He nodded, his eyes fixed on mine, a silent promise. Then, with a final, bracing breath, I pushed through the heavy steel door marked Restricted Access B4. The air in the basement was thick, cold, and still. The hum of distant machinery was a low thrum against my ears, a counterpoint to the frantic beat of my own heart. I moved through a labyrinth of forgotten equipment, rusted gurneys, stacked crates, and shrouded forms that could have been anything from broken X-ray machines to embalming tables. My footsteps echoed, each one a drumbeat of my approaching confrontation. Then I saw it. A faint glow ahead, emanating from a room whose door was ajar. As I drew closer, the metallic scent intensified, cutting through the stale air. Was this the right move? Had I miscalculated? What if I'm wrong? What if this isn't them? Or worse, what if they're just too powerful? But the faces of the dead, the fragmented bones screaming their stories, pushed the doubt aside. I had to know. I had to expose them. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, stepping into the room. It was smaller than I expected, dominated by a stainless steel table in the center, starkly lit by a single, focused overhead lamp. It wasn't the detective, as I'd half feared, nor one of the known enforcers. This was the leader. I fought to keep my expression neutral. My hand hovering over the stun gun. The camera was recording. It had to be, he gestured to the table. I've been a persistent gnat buzzing around our work. Intrusive, dangerous, but also predictable. My obsession with the dead is well documented. He picked up a small, sharpened bone shard, turning it in his fingers. These are from the first harvest, aren't they? He knew exactly what I'd found. He wasn't just aware of my investigation. He He'd been watching it unfold. "Harvest," I scoffed, trying to inject contempt into my voice. "You call mutilating innocent people harvesting?" "A necessary step," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "For renewal, for power. You see the wounds, Cole, the ritualistic patterns. You understand the intent even if you refuse to acknowledge the purpose." He moved around the table, his movements fluid, unhurried. "We don't just kill, Cole, we transform, we offer. The unique mutilations you've been so fixated on, the precise removal of certain bones, the specific cuts, they are not random acts of violence. They are offerings, each one a key unlocking something greater." He stopped opposite me, separated by the table and its grim display. "You've been trying to give voice to the dead, haven't you? A noble pursuit if misguided. But what if the dead want to be silent? Only to those who lack understanding. You see decay, Cole. We see potential, these bones." He swept a hand over the fragments. "They are not just remnants, they are conduits, and with each offering our organization gains strength, ensuring the continuity of certain traditions." My eyes scanned the room, searching for an escape, for an advantage. My mind raced, piecing together his words with everything I'd learned. The specific bones, the patterns, the locations of the graves. It wasn't just about power. It was about specific power, drawn from specific sacrifices. The emergency autopsy wasn't a cover for moving a body. It was a cover for processing a harvest, perhaps even a new one. This basement was their sanctum. "The patterns," I responded, pointing to a particularly jagged fragment. "The specific bone fractures, the deliberate removal of the hyoid, the sternum. It's not just a ritual. It's a signature. A signature that spans centuries, connecting your organization to every mass grave I've ever studied with these exact markers. The ancient traditions are just a cover for systematic murder, and I have proof." His calm facade finally cracked, a flicker of something sharp and predatory entering his eyes. "Proof?" he scoffed. There was a new edge to his voice. "What proof could you possibly have that hasn't already been accounted for?" "The unique isotopic signatures in the bones," I stated, my voice gaining strength. "The ones that match specific geological regions, not just across the country, across continents. You've been moving your victims or your ritual artifacts for a long, long time, and the carbon dating doesn't lie. This isn't just one serial killer. This is generations, an unbroken chain, and I've documented it all. The patterns, the isotopes, the age, the story the bones tell." He took a step towards me, his gaze hardening. "A story that will die with you, Cole." He reached beneath his coat, and I saw the glint of steel. This wasn't a debate anymore. This was the climax. The camera, I hoped, was still rolling. The colleague I prayed had gotten the signal out. The dead deserved their voice, and I was about to risk everything to give it to them. The glint of steel was blinding, a cold spark against the dimness of the warehouse. His words, "A story that will die with you, Cole," echoed in the sudden, sharp silence. My hand, already gripping the stun gun, tightened. This wasn't a calculated move, not anymore. It was instinct, a primal surge of survival. I raised the device, aiming for the center mass just as he lunged. The crackle was loud, an unnatural sound in the cavernous space. He stiffened mid-stride, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and disbelief, the knife clattering uselessly to the concrete floor. His body seized, muscles locking, and then he crumpled. A heavy sack of bones and malice, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. My breath hitched, ragged and shallow. I stood there frozen, the stun gun still humming faintly in my hand, its plastic casing suddenly feeling much heavier. The air was thick with the scent of dust and ozone, and something else, the metallic tang of fear, perhaps my own. I waited, listening, convinced he would stir, that this wouldn't be enough. Footsteps pounded then, heavy and urgent. The detective burst through the side door, weapon drawn, followed by a handful of officers. "Are I all right?" The detective's voice was rough, strained. I nodded, unable to speak, pointing a trembling finger at the prone figure. He came at me. The detective assessed the scene in a glance, barking orders. Officers moved in, securing the area, cuffing the unconscious man. One of them, a younger officer, knelt to retrieve the dropped knife, carefully bagging it. "The camera," I managed, my voice hoarse. "Is it still rolling?" Detective looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He moved to the small, discreet device I had placed earlier, checking its indicator light. "It is," he confirmed, a grim satisfaction in his tone. Every word, every move. That single confirmation was a lifeline. It meant the truth wouldn't die in this warehouse. The next few hours were a blur of statements, debriefings, and the controlled chaos of a crime scene being processed. The footage from the hidden camera, combined with the earlier evidence I had painstakingly collected, proved to be the linchpin. The captured man, the strategist behind the ritualistic mutilations, was identified. His confession, albeit coerced by the circumstances of his capture, quickly unraveled the threads of the ancient organization. It was like pulling a loose stitch on a rotten tapestry. Once one gave way, the whole thing began to unravel. Arrests followed swiftly, a ripple effect across several regions. It was exposed, its members brought into the unforgiving glare of the legal system. Days later, I found myself in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested. The air was cool, sterile, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and final. He was no longer a threat, just a body, another set of bones waiting for their story to be told, albeit a much shorter one than his victims. The forensic pathologist, a quiet, methodical colleague, was already at work, preparing for the examination. My presence was mostly for confirmation, a final link between the living and the dead, to ensure every detail of his physical being aligned with the ritualistic patterns I had unearthed. I watched, my gaze drawn to the intricate markings on his skin tattoos I hadn't noticed in the heat of the confrontation. Symbols that mirrored the ancient iconography found on the artifacts near the mass grave. He hadn't just orchestrated the rituals, he had been a devout participant. He truly believed in the twisted ideology he imposed on others. A wave of exhaustion washed over me, heavy and bone-deep. The physical confrontation had been brief, but the emotional toll of the entire case had been immense. Standing there, looking at the man who represented so much of the horror, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and profound weariness. We had stopped him, stopped them, but the images of the fragmented remains, the silent screams of the victims, were etched into my mind. The media frenzy that followed was immediate and overwhelming. I avoided interviews, deflecting praise, pushing the focus back to the victims and the meticulous work of the wider investigative team. It wasn't about me, it was about them. It always had been. Later, alone in my quiet apartment, the silence was deafening. I replayed the confrontation, his words, the glint of the knife. Could I have handled it differently, moved faster? What if the camera hadn't worked? What if I hadn't carried the stun gun? The what-ifs gnawed at me, insidious little insects burrowing into my resolve. I had done what I had to do, but the line between self-preservation and justice felt thin, precarious. I had been so sure, so determined, but now, in the quiet aftermath, a seed of doubt began to sprout. Had I truly given voice to the dead, or had I simply added another violent chapter to their already tragic story? No, that wasn't right. The justice came not from that single moment, but from the dismantling of the organization, from the arrests, from the eventual trials that would bring their heinous acts into the light. The story of the dead would not die with me nor with him. It would live on, a testament to their suffering and, finally, to their peace. The quiet hum of the city outside became a different sound then, not a reminder of my isolation, but a steady pulse of a world slowly, painstakingly righting itself. The dead had spoken, and I had been there to listen. The fluorescent lights of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested hummed, a sterile counterpoint to the quiet intensity of my work. The air was thick with the metallic tang I'd grown accustomed to, but here it felt sharper, more immediate. This wasn't the dusty open-air excavation of the mass grave, nor the controlled chaos of the warehouse. This was an isolated chamber, the last stage of a long, torturous journey. The remains before me were different. Not a victim of the ritualistic mutilations I'd become intimately familiar with, but a fresh set, brought in under an urgent directive. This body, the authorities believed, belonged to one of the orchestrators, found after the warehouse raid, a casualty of what the detective called internal disagreements. My task was to confirm the identification and, more critically, search for any physical markers that could further expose the organization's inner workings. My gloved fingers traced the contours of a femur. No ancient modifications, no carefully excised bone fragments, just the clean, stark reality of a recent demise. Yet, even in death, the body held secrets. I leaned closer, adjusting the magnifying lamp, my breath fogging the clear plastic shield I wore. Along the posterior aspect of the shaft, near the linea aspera, I felt it, a faint, almost imperceptible ridge. Not a fracture callus, not a natural variation, something deliberate. I used a fine probe, gently scraping away adhering tissue, revealing a shallow, linear indentation. It was subtle, almost invisible to the naked eye, a testament to its intended secrecy. I'd seen similar marks on some of the earlier victims, dismissed then as incidental damage or perhaps a pre-existing injury. But seeing it here, on a supposed perpetrator, it coalesced into something chillingly significant. It wasn't a mutilation for sacrifice, but a mark of belonging. A brand etched into the bone itself, not on the skin that would decay. Wait, that doesn't add up, I murmured to myself, the words barely audible in the quiet room. The previous victims had the ritualistic marks, yes, but some also bore this subtle, almost hidden bone scar. Why would the victims share a mark with their supposed tormentors? Unless the line between victim and perpetrator was blurrier than we'd initially believed. Unless the victims were chosen from within their own ranks, or perhaps initiates who failed, or were deemed unworthy. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, colder than the sterile air. It wasn't just sacrifice, it was a purge, a grotesque internal cleansing. I remembered the analysts' early reports on bone density, the peculiar nutritional deficiencies found in some of the older remains. We'd attributed it to a specific, isolated community. Now I wondered if it was a diet enforced by the organization itself, a way to control and identify its members from birth. The pieces clicked into place, not just about what they did, but who they were, and how deeply ingrained their control was. The detective arrived a few hours later, his face etched with exhaustion. He watched me work, a silent presence. "Anything, Cole?" he inquired, his voice rough. I straightened, pushing the shield up. "This mark," I began, pointing with my gloved finger. "It's on some of the original victims too, not the sacrificial mutilations, but a deeper structural one, a type of internal branding. I suspect it's genetic, or acquired very early in life, perhaps through specific dietary practices or even intentional minor trauma during infancy. It marks them as part of the lineage, part of the organization. The ones in the mass grave, they weren't just random outsiders. It explains the meticulous nature, the ritual. It was an internal affair, a horrifying assertion of power and purity within their own ranks. The confirmation hung heavy in the air. It was a truth far more disturbing than a simple serial killer or even a foreign cult. This was a homegrown horror, generations deep, self-perpetuating. The footage from the hidden cameras in the warehouse, the frantic scramble to apprehend the remaining members, it all made sense now. They weren't just protecting secrets, they were protecting an entire, twisted way of life. The next few days were a blur of reports, consultations, and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. Some arrests were made, key figures apprehended, their network at least temporarily dismantled, and the dead, through my work, had finally spoken. I stood by a window overlooking the city, the urban sprawl a stark contrast to the desolate grave sites and the sterile hospital basement. The case was closed for now. The faces of the victims, pieced together from bone fragments and the unique mutilations, flashed through my mind. I had given them what they deserved: recognition, truth, and a measure of justice. But the closure I felt was not absolute. It would morph, adapt, find new cracks to exploit. My work was never truly done. There would always be new bones, new mysteries, new voices waiting to be heard. And I, Cole, would always be ready to listen.